this world stops turning. Ashes where the body's burning.
I had been to the Gettysburg battlefield many times, and had always heard great ghost stories about the place, but I had never had a similar experience, and I was getting increasingly suspicious that these stories might be fictional. Nonetheless, finding myself in Gettysburg one evening, I decided to drive around the battlefield and see if my ghost hunting luck might improve. It was a warm night for this activity, being clear and warm with a near full moon, providing lots of light. As I drove towards Culp's Hill, where the organized ghost tours never seemed to go. I drove slowly down the road with my arm out the window, noting the pale grey monuments that lined the roadway, when, as I rounded my turn, my headlights illuminated a distinctly different monument. This one had a top half that was dark and a lower half of a lighter color, and reminded me of a Union soldier's navy blue coat and light blue trousers. Then, as I got closer, it actually turned to face my car. That's when I saw that it actually was a navy blue sack coat and light blue trousers, completely three-dimensional, but with no visible person inside the clothing. There seemed to be just a very pale illuminated oval above the coat collar where the face should be, but nothing else, not even shoes, so the bottom of the trousers didn't even reach the ground. As I noted this, he began walking slowly toward the open driver's side window of my car. As it casually walked towards me, with empty sleeves swinging at its side and empty pant legs taking step after step without quite touching the ground, my stomach tied itself in knots and my mind raced through a million thoughts at once. And not just the obvious ones like, what does it want? What will it do? Why me? No, I also thought, those clothes look absolutely real, and the weave of the wall is just like the ones in the museum. And if I could make my hand move, I could touch it, and it would feel as real as my t-shirt and jeans. Then, as it got within inches of the car, one thought broke my paralysis. It's going to climb in, right through the window, over the top of me, and into the car. That was the motivation I needed to find the accelerator and go. And as I did, the apparition disappeared as if it had never been. I raced back to the comfort of streetlights and people in town as fast as I could, but no sooner than I got there than I wished I had stayed more rational and maybe tried to communicate with the spirit. Still, this had been the perfect way to convince me of ghosts. It didn't look like any ghost I had ever imagined, plus the moonlight was so bright that I could clearly see the details, and with no wires or tree limbs overhead to suspend it, and the bottom of the legs not touching the ground, I couldn't think of any way it could have been faked. I called my wife at home the next morning and told her I officially believe in ghosts.
Well, this is my first time posting on r/paranormal, but I think my experience is extremely notable. I actually remember everything like it was yesterday, even the date. It was on the night of December 28th, 2008. I was 14 at the time. I had just seen a Hershey Bears hockey game with my Boy Scout troop, and was taken by my parents to a party that was being thrown by my father's friends from college. This party lasted late into the evening, and in order to get home, we had to pass the Gettysburg battlefield on Lincoln Way, 30 West. After we passed through Gettysburg at about 1:30 a.m., I looked out to my right, towards the battlefield and the peace light. What had caught my eye was a man on horseback with a Civil War-style officer's hat. At first, I thought this was the monument, because I had passed through that area a number of times beforehand during the day. I knew there was a statue of a man on horseback in the area. However, after staring at this object long enough, I noticed that the object was moving away from Gettysburg. and I even saw the horse's head moving as it trotted along. There was also a light in the distance that passed behind the man's head as he rode along, showing his head's movement. There was also a line of black mass extending from the road towards the peace light and the tree line. My father caught a clear view of the man on horseback and this mass. He told me later that that was a line of Confederate soldiers crouched on the ground. However, what shocked both my father and I was these little blue lights that seemed to be all around the tree line, between the open field and the peace light. I later returned to the battlefield to see the statue of the man on horseback, to determine if what I saw was simply my imagination. However, when I saw the statue, it was facing as though it was riding towards Gettysburg. It was an experience that I shall never forget.
Let me spin you a tale of what it is I experienced at Wilson's Creek Battlefield in August of 2011. It started out as a girls' weekend. My mother, sister and I decided we were going to have a girls' weekend before I had to go back to college later in August. With Mum and I both loving history and my sister willing to play along, we decided we'd go to Wilson's Creek Battlefield, which is near Republic, Missouri. It is one of the more famous Civil War battlefields in the state of Missouri, and was only about a 2.5-hour drive from our home. After going to the battlefield, we were going to swing up to Kansas City for the night and enjoy Kansas City during the day. Only another 2.5 to 3 hour drive. We weren't worried about time. We had plenty of it to spare and had no set schedule. When we arrived at Wilson's Creek Battlefield, we toured the small museum and obtained our tickets to go into the park to be able to drive the circle that has been set up. The battlefield is broken down into several stops, 8 to be exact. The first 2 stops were fairly uneventful. We found where the old mill site was and were able to get a look through the windows of the old large house that sits up on the hill. At the third stop, however, in order to get to what is known as Edward's Cabin, you have to walk roughly 3/4 of a mile down the hill, and then another half mile across the flat and over the creek. Mind you, this is in August in Missouri, and is hot, humid, and just plain out unpleasant. When you are making your way down the hill, you cross over a small bridge, and then have the option of turning left, right, or going up a steep hillside. At this point, my mother and sister had given up. The sign originally had said only 3/4 of a mile or so, and they told me if I wanted to press on, they'd wait for me in the shade of the trees on the other side of the bridge. At this point, I'd made it that far, and decided another half mile was worth it to see what it was we'd come to see. So I continued on my way, crossing over the larger bridge and making it to the house. When you reach Edward's house, it is sitting in the middle of the field, and about 50 yards from the house is a large placard explaining that the house that sits on the side is not the original house that sat there, but it's original to the time and was moved after the original house was destroyed. It also explains a bit of the history, how it was used, etc., etc. While reading this sign, I felt the ground give a little shake, and I looked up. As I looked up at the house began to shake more, and so did the ground, except it wasn't a constant shake. It was a shake like you'd experience during heavy artillery fire or cannon fire. After only 10 or 15 seconds though, it stopped. While thinking it was strange, I was still determined to see the house. The grass was tall enough that when walking straight up to the house, I didn't see the stairs on the right-hand side. So I walked around the house from the left-hand side. When I arrived at the back of the house, there was a door. Being the curious person I was, I went up the stairs to try and open it, but it wouldn't budge. Shrugging it off, I continued around the house until I found the stairs that I had previously missed, and went up to the front door to find it opened easily. Inside, there was little to nothing. Dust, an old fireplace, and an otherwise empty one-room building. My curiosity, however, got the better of me, and I went to open the back door, curious if it would open. Without a hitch, with little to no pressure, the door opened, no problem. Weird. After seeing the inside, I started back towards the car. By this time, It had probably been 30 minutes or so. My mother and sister had grown tired of being in the sweltering heat, even under the shade of the trees, and had gone back towards the car for the AC, though not uneventfully. When they decided they had had enough of waiting, they started back up the hill. About 5 minutes into their walk back up the hill, my mother heard someone call out, "Mom!" She looked at my sister and asked if she heard it, to which she responded she hadn't. So they kept up. Not even 20 steps further up, my mother once again heard, "Mom!" But this time, so did my sister. They stood still for a moment to try and determine where it was coming from, only to start up the hill again. And to hear, a third time, someone yell, "Mom!" Now, you need to understand, we were the only ones there. There hadn't been anyone before us, and we hadn't seen anyone after us. The people in the visitor's place even welcomed us as the first guests of the day, at a little before noon. My mum and my sister just laughed it off and went to the car. When I finally arrived at the car, they were both laughing, and my mother looked at me and asked, "Oh, did you lose your mummy?" Only to fall dead silent when I asked her what the hell she was talking about. That I figured that they'd grown tired of waiting for me in the heat and had moved back to the car when I wasn't back in 10 minutes or so. We continued to the different stops, viewing 2 of the battlefields and a battery. My mother had problems with the battery. When she crossed the bridge to look at the cannons, she became physically ill. But when recrossing it, the symptoms were gone. She'd cross again only to get sick again. I quickly looked over the cannons and returned to my mum's sister in car. And we started back down the path to the 7th stop, Totten's Battery and Bloody Hill. While on the way towards Bloody Hill, things turned stranger. I brought along a camera that I had been taking pictures with, and while we were driving towards Bloody Hill, my camera turned itself on. The only way I knew it turned on was that it was a digital camera, that when you turned it on, the lens extended out. Thinking it was kind of strange for the camera to turn on by itself, I pointed it out the window and took a couple of pictures. Let me just say, we definitely weren't alone. When we got to Bloody Hill, both my sister and my mother were done, so I went up to the placard by myself as they sat in the car. The placards explained that this was General Lyon's last stand, and at the bottom of the hill are 3 cannons. So I zoomed in and took the picture, and off we went. But again, we learned we weren't alone. All in all, it was an interesting time with lots of history to be learned, and a fair amount of strangeness to be had for all.
I've never told anyone about this, except my mom, because I don't think anyone else would believe me. When I was 13 or so, my parents drove our family from Texas to Virginia to visit family. My mom is all about things being educational and killing 2 birds with 1 stone, so one of our stops was in Gettysburg. We took a day to tour the town and the battlefields, and then we're supposed to stay in a B&B that night. The B&B was located either right on or very, very close to one of the battlefields. I don't remember which it was. The entire town was super creepy, and the B&B had a weird feel to it. Like there was a tension in the air. We checked in and everyone went to bed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up, completely alert. Despite it being mid-July in a 19th century building with a window unit AC that limped along just enough to keep the temperature below 80, the room was ice cold, and there was something standing next to me. I'm very glad I had the presence of mind to not open my eyes, or even move an inch. I'm pretty sure it knew I was awake anyways, because after about 30 seconds, I could feel it lean down and look me straight in the face. It did not like me or my family. It wanted us out. I could feel how angry it was. After a while, it left my side of the bed and went to look at my brother, my dad, and my mom. It stayed longest by my dad for some reason. I could tell because I could feel its footsteps on the floor. There wasn't a sound, but there was that definite feel of heavy feet on the floorboards. It came back around to me again, and stood for a long time. Very close, very hateful. Then it was just gone. I can't tell you how I knew it hated us and wanted us gone. It was like that feeling you get when someone is angry at you, but you don't know why and you're scared to ask. Turned up to 11. I kept this to myself until about 18 months ago, when I told my mom that I hated Gettysburg and wouldn't ever stay there again. She just said, "Is it because of that thing that was in the hotel room? I saw it too." Which, of course it is. And that's why I'm never going back to Gettysburg.
I was around 18 at the time of my experience, and it happened at the Oriskany battlefield. For those unfamiliar with the Battle of Oriskany, it was considered one of the bloodiest battles of the Revolutionary War. I want to get into my experience, so I will quickly sum up the battle that took place on this site, August 6th, 1777. As the story goes, around 800 patriots were marching to a nearby fort when they stopped at a small creek to drink some water before continuing their march towards their destination, which was 6 miles away. The creek is located at the bottom of a ravine and has 2 fields on each side, with it being more heavily wooded at the bottom around the creek. A large force, mainly consisting of Native Americans who were British loyalists, had picked this spot to set up an ambush, which had caught the Patriots off guard, and started the battle, which resulted in over 400 deaths. Rumor has it that the small creek at the bottom of the ravine ran red for some time after the battle, and that many of the injured men left behind had an agonizing death due to their injuries and being subjected to the elements. Getting back to my experience at the battlefield, I've had many unexplained things happen while at the battlefield, but I'm going to tell the one that scared me the most. I had gone to the battlefield during a summer's night with one of my close friends. We didn't walk down the ravine, but stayed between the field and where the ground started to dip, going down to the creek. At the time of my experience, we were both sitting down and had been silent for about 30 seconds when we suddenly heard a sound in the distance, which we both questioned, but quickly agreed that it was most likely a truck driving on a road in the distance. It was within the first 5 seconds after we stopped talking that whatever was around us had made itself known. Both our heads were facing the same direction, and we suddenly heard a very distinctive deep breathing behind us. The best way I can describe the sound is if someone was gasping for air through only their mouth, but they were doing it at a much slower pace than someone who might actually be gasping for air. At this point, we looked at each other, and the sound became louder and louder, and sounded as though it originated from 3 feet behind our heads. I wish at that time we decided to stay and try to debunk the situation. However, it didn't take long before we ran away. What was rather interesting is how the sound followed us as we ran. It was as if no matter how fast or far we ran, the sound's origin would always be 3 feet behind our heads. Eventually, as we got further away from the field, the sound stopped, and the feeling of being followed had gone away with it. Once we calmed down and got into our cars, we drove our separate ways to our childhood homes. Here is where things get really interesting. This was a time where all the teenagers were just getting into texting, and AOL Instant Messenger was the big communication hub. Like most kids around my age at that time, I would always go on AIM for an hour or so before bed. While on, I received a message from my friend who was with me at the battlefield. He had told me that he couldn't find his phone and thinks he dropped it during our run while being chased by that gasping sound. He later drove to my house, where we gained the courage to drive back to the same place we frantically ran out of. We cautiously walked side by side into the battlefield to retrace our steps, while I kept calling his phone to see if we could hear it vibrate or see the small caller ID screen light up on front of the flip phone. We were still shook up about our experience, which was still fresh in our minds since it was only about an hour and a half since it had happened. We power walked into the area since we didn't want to be there, but also had to take our time looking for his phone. As soon as we got to the same location where the gasping sounds stopped, it started again and began to follow us like before. My friend kept saying, "I'm only here for my phone," but the sound was still following us and sounding more and more menacing and louder with each gasp it made. Luckily, we had located the phone only after about 15 seconds of the sound following us. We turned around and sprinted away just as we did before. Oddly enough, the same thing happened where the sound turned around as well, followed us, and stopped at the same location. It has been almost 10 years since this happened, and we can't help but find ourselves talking about this experience among ourselves and with others around us. I suppose we were lucky to have experienced this together and have someone else to talk with about it over the years.
So this weekend, my husband and I made our first trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We stayed at an inn that was once inhabited by a girl named Tilly Pierce and her family. And during the Civil War, the house was a makeshift hospital. I've never had any experiences with the paranormal, so I wasn't expecting to here, even though it's said the house is haunted. The first night we stayed there, Sunday, we decided to take a walk around town around 9:30 or 10 p.m. While we were getting ready, the light on the nightstand was flickering like crazy. Creepy, but could be explained, so we just unplugged it. We headed out for a walk and no one was out. It had just rained and the bars and restaurants were closed, so not much to do, but we were new in town and wanted to scope things out for the daylight. We got back in at almost midnight, climbed up the creaking stairs and to our room. To briefly describe our room, it was a street view room that sat above the dining room area of the house. The other guests in the inn were fast asleep by the time we got back. We sat on the bed for about 10, maybe 15 minutes, and out of nowhere, we heard a young girl start singing. I'd say mid-song, no music. The song sounded like some type of hymn, or maybe a popular song among the young people of that time. After about 30 seconds of singing, a muffled woman's voice, almost scolding, said something like, "You're 15, and that's all we could make out. Again, no one was on the sidewalks, and we saw the other guests. No young girls were in attendance. The sounds came from directly below us in the dining room area, and we had just walked in about 20 minutes prior to a darkened house. We both looked at each other in shock, but still didn't register that it could be a spirit that we just overheard. Monday came and went, and Tuesday morning we gathered for breakfast at the dining room table of the inn with the other guests. The innkeeper was talking about the history of the house, and had mentioned that he brought a psychic in, and she had felt the presence of a young girl, possibly Tilly. Another guest says, "Wasn't she 15? My husband and I practically broke our necks looking at each other when we recalled what we heard Sunday night. Now, Tilly didn't pass away in the house, or even Gettysburg, but could it be a residual haunting? We both heard it so clear and loud. It was like we were hearing a snippet of a memory, but it wasn't bad or scary. It was actually very beautiful."
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below.
So feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.